my memory on something. Have I or have I not spoken with you about how people, I think I did, about how people get into the calendar in Anglicanism?
No, I shouldn't say.
I didn't.
I don't know.
Local.
We haven't heard it.
Yeah.
Local, there's no, there's no,
There's no
Vatican is doing
process
its local
per
group.
se, yeah, and I ask you to remember that. I do want to remind you before we begin about what I had said about Tudor England. Tudor England was a period of almost continuous internal conflict in Britain itself. It was not just between the church and the kings, although there was a lot of that, obviously, but it was also between various strains of Christianity. And, you know, I've been talking about Protestants and Catholics, and that was very important. That was the most important. But there was internal conflict there too. On the Protestant side, there was a great deal of Lutheran influence. But the Lutherans didn't get along with the Calvinists at all, and there was a significant amount of Calvinism, and they didn't think much of Luther. They thought he was sort of a halfway guy. And on the Catholic side, by the period we're going to be talking about, the early 1600s, 1500s, watch it, Red, 16th century. There was a great deal of conflict between the real conservatives who wanted to stick with Rome and were rumbling about Henry breaking with Rome, and then there were Catholics who were okay with the break, but they didn't want to see any changes in the church per se, in the practices and the beliefs. So that's the background for tonight's session on Thomas Cranmer. Cranmer was born in 1489. His father was one Thomas Cranmer, and his father was, I'm going to use a big word, his father was armigerous. That means he had a coat of arms, okay? So they were not the lowest strata of society, but they were clearly the lowest rank of the gentry, because his father had 3 sons, and he only had enough property to endow his eldest son. So Thomas, the middle son, and a younger brother were destined for careers in the church, one way or another. So in terms of education, they were educated by some schoolmaster. We don't know who he was. All we know is that Cranmer described him as marvelous, severe, and cruel. But in 1503, at the age of 14, he went off to Cambridge. He was happy at Cambridge. He stayed there for a long time. It was not uncommon for young men to go off to Cambridge or Oxford for a year or two and then leave. But he stayed quite a while. And in 1510 or 1511, we're not quite sure which, he was elected to a fellowship, that is a teaching position. But he soon lost it. He lost it because the fellowship was, a requirement of the fellowship was that whoever held it lived at the college and had to be single. And he got married. Marriages were going to be a problem for him. He married a woman named Jane, which she was very low-born. We don't even know her last name. And all we know is that she was some sort of relative, maybe daughter, maybe niece, of a woman who was the landlady and keeper of the Dolphin Inn. Okay, so this is not really a prestigious marriage for Thomas. So he lost his fellowship at Jesus College, but he had already had a reputation as a promising teacher, pretty good scholar. So what was then Buckingham College, now Magdalen College, allowed him to live and teach there as long as he left his wife at the Dolphin. So they were living separately, in both of them in Cambridge. She did not live very long. She died after childbirth, and the child died as well, I believe. And after that, Jesus College welcomed him back, as long as he didn't decide to get married again, which he didn't at this point. He, at this point, really devoted himself really wholeheartedly to Christian scholarship. And he became very widely read in any manner having to do with the church. He apparently had a very, very good memory, and he became considered a person of considerable knowledge, but he was no Erasmus. He was no Thomas More. He wasn't really an original thinker. He wasn't really creative, but he had a very significant amount of knowledge. And in 1523, he was ordained. Now, he was not a member of a monastic order of any sort, but he really seemed set for a life at Cambridge that would be suitable to a medieval scholar monk, living in an all-male community which was dedicated to scholarship, to learning and teaching. And it looked like he was set for that for life. He was very well suited for it. But he wasn't. He got called out of that life by, well, what I chose to describe as coincidence and accident. Here's what happened. This was while the negotiations were going on with the Pope, where Cardinal Wolsey was trying to get the Pope to say yes to Henry annulling having his first marriage annulled so he could marry Anne Boleyn. Well, it became obvious that this was going nowhere, that Wolsey had failed. And even though no judgment had been handed down from Rome yet, it was pretty obvious that things were not going well for reasons I'll go into in a moment. And this Wolsey failed, and that's what resulted in Wolsey being dismissed as chancellor, falling completely out of favor with Henry. At this point, Henry VIII remembered an incident from a few months earlier. He had been in Essex, visiting Waltham Abbey, and two of his entourage, when the king traveled, he traveled with a whole lot of people. Two bishops, Bishop Gardiner and Bishop Fox, were lodging at the house of a Mr. Cressy. And Mr. Cressy, it was in the summertime when Cambridge was not in session, and Mr. Cressy had employed Cranmer to act as a tutor for his young son. That evening, one evening, Cressy hosted the king for a dinner, at which Cranmer was present. And of course, everybody, the talk at the king was consumed with the king's desire for an annulment of his marriage and the probability of the Pope granting one. Well, the probability was approaching zero. Remember, Clement VII, who was the king at that point, was virtually a prisoner of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. His forces had recently occupied Rome very brutally. This was known as the sack of Rome, and it was terrible. Most of his troops were Lutheran. He himself was Catholic. Most of his troops were Lutheran, and they went nuts. They sacked Rome. Rome, at the time it fell to Charles V's troops, at the time it fell, it had 50,000 inhabitants. When they were finished, it was 10,000. Now, not all those were killed. A lot were. There was a lot of looting and all the rest. But the plague broke out. which eventually sent the Emperor Charles home. But the plague broke out, and of course a lot of people just fled. But by the time he was finished, Rome was a shell. During the period that Charles V's imperial forces were occupying Rome, Clement VII was hiding out in Castel Sant'Angelo, which, for those of you who know Rome, you'll know Castel Sant'Angelo. It's the former mausoleum of Augustus, which is on the end of the bridge with the angels on it, okay, on the southern end. So Charles's army is surrounding him, and the Pope didn't think it was too good an idea to say get rid of the Queen Catherine of Aragon, because she was the Emperor Charles's aunt. So the Pope pretty much had the Emperor's foot on his neck, and it seemed almost certain that the answer from Rome was going to be no. At this dinner, Cranmer suggested that what came to be referred to as the King's Great Matter might suitably be put to university faculties, the theological and canon law faculties, to get their judgments on it. And that would put some pressure, and give some legitimacy that it didn't otherwise have. And that suggestion was passed on to the king. Henry was delighted. He instructed Cranmer, who was now back at Cambridge, to prepare a brief on the subject, and appointed him chaplain to the Earl of Wiltshire. Guess who he was? He was Anne Boleyn's father. That's who he was. So Cranmer is suddenly in the middle of this controversy. The universities, as it turned out, both of them, proved reluctant to reach a finding that the king would have found satisfactory. Reluctant, but not completely unwilling. So after some not terribly well-veiled threats and a little civilized bribery and a good deal of committee packing, they decided that, well, yes, after all, Henry did have a legal and moral right to leave Catherine of Aragon behind and marry Anne Boleyn. In the meantime, the Earl of Wiltshire, Anne Boleyn's father, had gone abroad with the Earl of Wiltshire on a diplomatic mission. Cranmer's moving up the ranks fast. The point was to try to influence people within the Holy Roman Empire, people of influence within the empire. Wiltshire was supposed to get them on the king's side, and Cranmer was supposed to go to the European universities and plead the king's case. So on this trip, Cranmer made important contacts with some of the German princes, many of whom were Lutherans, and also with several leading Lutheran clergy. One of these was a man named Andreas Oslander in Nuremberg. Cranmer fell in love with Oslander's niece and married her. Now, this was an open defiance of church law. And it's a clear indication of direction in which Cranmer's attitude to ecclesiastical discipline and authority was moving. For a priest, or even a cardinal, as Wolsey had proven, to have a mistress or two might be winked at, but to marry, oh no, that's open rebellion against Rome. Can't do that. It also came near, this marriage, to wrecking a personal plan of Henry's. Because when William Warham, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury, died, the king decided that Cranmer should be the next Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, clerical celibacy was not required in the Roman Catholic Church until 1139. It was before that, you wanted to have a wife, it was okay. It wasn't common, but it was okay. It was legal. But the thought of a married Archbishop of Canterbury raised violent objections in England and, of course, in Rome. Henry nevertheless put on a lot of pressure and somehow managed to obtain from the Pope, by this time he was no longer under siege at Castel San Angelo, the requisite dispensations. Cranmer stayed on the continent. He knew, he had been informed that Henry wanted to have him named Archbishop of Canterbury. But he apparently didn't want to very much. He stayed on the continent, traveling around, visiting with various important people, and continuing his investigation, I guess you'll call it, into Lutheranism. But finally, in February 1533, he arrived back in England, only to find that Henry, 2 weeks earlier, had already secretly married Anne Boleyn. He arrived back in February. He was consecrated Archbishop in March. Less than 3 years ago, he'd been a scholarly priest teaching and pursuing his own solitary studies at Cambridge. Now, he was the Archbishop of all England.
What did he do with his wife?
He brought her with him
Okay.
and tried to keep her hidden. All right?
Sorry.
The following May, he pronounced Henry's marriage to Catherine null and void. And 5 days later, he declared the validity of the king's marriage to Anne. And when the Princess Elizabeth, Anne's daughter, was baptized in September, he not only performed the ceremony, he was one of her godfathers. This is when Parliament passed the Act of Succession. You'll remember this from last session, which formally acknowledged the legitimacy of whatever offspring might result from this new royal marriage, male or female. Anybody of any rank or consequence or influence was required to take an oath to obey the provisions of that act. And it was for refusing to do that Thomas More and Bishop Fisher of Rochester were sent to the Tower and condemned to death. So we're talking about the same time frame we were talking about last session. To Cranmer's credit, despite Henry being pretty volatile, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, it is to Cranmer's credit that he really did try very hard to save both those men. He tried to convince them he tried hard to convince them to take the oath, but he failed, and they were both executed. As Archbishop of Canterbury, he would be involved in all of the king's repudiations of Anne and 3 subsequent wives. He seems to have been pretty much, in many ways, a tool of the king. Now, I want to talk about this business about Henry because I think it throws some light on last week's session as well as this week. I think I spoke about the fact that Henry had been badly injured in a jousting accident in 1536, where he got a leg injury that never really healed. And he was in pain and he couldn't exercise anymore. This is when he started getting so fat. I did a little looking into this and I was surprised at what I found. This was not Henry's first jousting injury. He'd been knocked off his horse quite a few times. And he'd been actually knocked out quite a few times. But this time, this was really, really serious. The people who were present thought he was going to die because he was unconscious for hours. And there is a lot of speculation that Henry had suffered some sort of traumatic brain injury because clearly he lacked emotional control after this. His last years he got increasingly erratic, and this is where his weight ballooned. The estimate is, now obviously nobody really knows, but the estimates that have been made put him at about 330 pounds, and he was 6'1". So yeah, that's not slim. And of course he had this leg problem. I did not know this, but he had wheelchairs and people to push him around. He could walk, but it gave him so much pain that in private, in the court, he was often, and there were actually winches to help him get up and down the stairs. Henry was in bad shape physically and quite possibly mentally, certainly emotionally.
Father Bragg, what year was that accident? I'm sorry.
1536. As I said, Henry had been pretty much a tool of the king, but in some respects, Cranmer and Henry were starting to come into opposition with each other. Seems like everybody around Henry came into opposition with him sooner or later. Why? Because Cranmer was becoming more and more dedicated to Lutheran-inspired Protestant reform proposals for the Church of England. But Henry wanted to retain more of the traditional Orthodox Catholic principles and practices. So that was the problem. In 1539, in this particular dispute, Henry won a major victory when Parliament passed a law, I think I've referred to it previously, known as the Act of 6 Articles, which reinforced the Church of England's, sorry, my fingers hit. I had a lot of trouble with my, okay, there we go. Reinforced Catholic doctrine and practice and explicitly rejected certain Protestant reforms. The important parts were an affirmation of transubstantiation, an affirmation of communion in one kind only, which was the Catholic practice then. The laity received the bread, but not the wine. The enforcement of clerical celibacy, which is interesting since Cranmer was married. The admission of private masses and upholding the validity of individual private confession. Now, those 6 articles, there were severe penalties for denying these articles. Not just for denying them, just for saying, no, that's not true. We don't believe that. A first offense could mean loss of goods and imprisonment, and the second offense could be punishable by death. The purpose was to placate the conservative religious opinion with Rome and to solidify royal supremacy, but maintain traditional church doctrine. And also to keep the Lutherans and the Zwinglians and the Calvinists from taking over. And it was definitely enforced. There were a number of notable reformers who were imprisoned and in many cases executed. It really slowed down the Protestant reforms. So the latter part of Henry's reign, it was in effect. It's significant historically because it shows Henry's conservative theological stance, despite the fact that he broke with Rome politically. But it's also helping to understand that the English Reformation goes back and forth because it was so much pushed by the state or suppressed by the state, depending on who was the monarch. The relationship between Henry and Cranmer for the last 8 years of his reign was extremely odd, particularly given how volatile Henry could be and how he could turn on his former friends. They disagreed on a number of important issues regarding the church. But Henry seems to have really liked Cranmer personally. Unlike most of Henry's courtiers, Henry was not devious. He was very open. He was not avaricious. He wasn't enriching himself like Wolsey, and he wasn't ambitious. Well, he didn't need to be ambitious. He was already Archbishop of Canterbury. It seems that he was almost the only person of any prominence who was actually willing to risk his standing with the king by pleading for mercy for those who had lost the king's favor. And he did so. He asked for mercy for Thomas More, for Anne Boleyn, even for his old personal enemy, Thomas Cromwell. He pleaded for all of them, and all of them were beheaded, no matter what Cranmer wanted. Cranmer, nevertheless, remained in Henry's personal affection. The king apparently respected his character. He listened to him, protected him from his enemies, whom he had plenty, but he allowed him no real political influence at all. None. It's interesting. When Henry lay dying in 1547, he let no one into his room except the Privy Council, not even his family. His wife and his daughters and his son were waited outside for news when members of the Privy Council came out as to how he was doing. But at the end, he called for Cranmer. And Cranmer was with him and held his hand as he died. Now, Henry VIII was succeeded by Edward VI. Edward was his only son. His mother had been Jane Seymour, who had died within a month after his birth, probably of puerperal fever. So Edward VI is next in line for the throne. He's also 9 years old. That didn't matter. Suddenly, Cranmer was a figure of very considerable importance because his uncle, Edward Seymour, Jane Seymour's brother, had himself named Lord Protector, which is virtually king until the king's old enough. Mm-hmm. And he was a very, very enthusiastic Protestant reformer. He set out to transform the Church of England into a Protestant church. Cranmer was enthusiastic about this. He endorsed it, he participated in it, and in some respects he was the chief directing figure of the Reformation, other than Edward Seymour himself. Before the year was out, Cranmer could work fast. Cranmer had prepared, and the king had published, the Book of Homilies. The Book of Homilies is mentioned, by the way, in the 39 articles. It was published in 1547. It's a small collection of sermons. There are only 12. Some were written by Cranmer, some were written by Hugh Latimer, and some possibly by Nicholas Ridley. They were two bishops. These homilies were intended to instruct the faithful in the Church of England on sound Christian doctrine and moral conduct. They were very, very Protestant, and every parish church was required to purchase one. Now, there are two reasons for this, for the fact of providing this book. Some people favor one, some favor the other. Personally, I think they were both true. One, a lot of the clergy were so poorly educated that they couldn't really preach, or if they did, it wouldn't be very sound doctrine. Or secondly, the Catholics, when they did preach, were preaching to Catholics, and this would be a counteragent to that, because they were still Catholic clergy who favored Catholic doctrine and practice. Again, the original book was published in 1547 with just 12 homilies. They address really foundational aspects of Christian faith and practice. They talk about the authority of Scripture, justification by faith, and the importance of good works. Second volume, which was expanded with another 20 homilies, was published in 1563, and one further homily in 1571. I don't know that it's much used anymore, but it's an important indication of the way things were going to go. It's also an important indication of extraordinary degree the invention of movable type had changed the dissemination of information and opinion when everything doesn't have to be canceled up by hand. In 1549, a prayer book, which was moderately Protestant but still largely Catholic, was published, the first Book of Common Prayer. It was immediately followed by the Prayer Book Rebellion. And this was no joke. The Prayer Book Rebellion, which took place primarily in Cornwall and Devon, that's way down this way in England, there were well over 5,000 people were killed. And this was, battlefield type stuff. And it was put down very bloodily. The interesting thing here is that in Cornwall and Devon, we can't say precisely, but we know there was still an awful lot of people, quite possibly a majority, who didn't speak English. Their home language was Cornish. So getting away from Latin and into English didn't suit them at all. And again, it was one of the more Catholic areas. In 1552, 3 years later, there came the second Book of Common Prayer, which was very much more leaning in the direction of Protestantism and was explicitly anti-Catholic. This provoked, again, lots of resistance. Now, Cranmer was personally responsible for a lot of this work, and we'll talk much later about Cranmer's role here. He was in charge. It was up to him to see what it was, but he had the assistance of a number of foreign theologians, because it had become known, of course, throughout Europe that Edward VI and his Lord Protector were hell-bent on turning England into a fully Protestant country. A lot of Protestant intellectuals came to England. Cranmer invited a lot of them. He arranged for them to teach at Oxford and Cambridge. He was pulling these guys in, particularly from Germany, but also from France and Italy. One of them, who was pretty prominent at the time, was known as, he was an Italian actually, Peter Martyr Vermidi, brought with him a book which was important in undermining the doctrine of the Eucharist. The book was St. John Chrysostom's Ad Caesarium Monachum. Sadly, it was a complete fake, but that didn't stop them from using it. And we know now that it was a complete fake, produced somewhere in Protestant Europe, and it was eagerly embraced by the Protestants because it seemed to undermine the patristic the church's ancient doctrines of the Eucharist. In these years, Cranmer also produced what were known as the 42 Articles. This is 1553. This was a set of doctrinal formulae defining the theological position of the Church of England on current religious controversies. Every clergyman, every schoolmaster, every candidate for a degree in the universities was compelled to give assent to the articles. If you didn't, you were out of your job or out of your position in the university. These were later reduced to 39 articles, and the church began to bind them into prayer books. They're not part of the Book of Common Prayer, but they're bound with it. You'll find them at the back. I don't recommend them. At this point, I think I should tell you, this attempt to set clear boundaries and clear definitions for the dogmatic theological positions of the church was not welcomed, and later centuries pretty much overlooked the idea until 1888. 1886. In 1886, a convention of Episcopal churchmen in Chicago produced a very important doctrine, and a very important document. It wasn't long, but it was really important, and it remains very important to a lot of us today. The question was, they produced it with the intention of providing a framework for future reunification between, it was an ecumenical document, between parts of the church. And the question was, what are the marks of the church? What can we say? Yes, we can be in full communion with you. It was aimed largely at the Orthodox and the Roman Catholics, and it came up and it was endorsed in 1888 at the Lambeth Conference. The Lambeth Conference is a conference that is held by the Archbishop of Canterbury. I forget, I think it's every 10 years, but I'm not certain about that. And any bishop in the Anglican communion can attend. So it's known as the Chicago Lambeth Quadrilateral, or sometimes just the Lambeth Quadrilateral, because it said that there are 4 marks of the church. The first is Holy Scripture as a rule of faith and containing all things necessary to salvation. The second is the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed. The third, the sacraments of baptism and the Lord's Supper, and that must be administered with Christ's words of institution. This is my body, which is my blood, and the historic episcopate. That's it. Well, the 39 articles go much further than that. This is the rule of faith for Anglicans. Cranmer removed conservative bishops and university theology professors from their offices and replaced them with Protestants, often foreigners. One result of this was that more and more important political figures in England began to believe that he and his followers had gone way too far in their repudiations of traditional Catholic doctrine and practice. I mean, it was one thing to say, okay, the Pope has no authority over English law. It's quite another to deny the presence of Christ in the Eucharist, which some of these guys did. And they were alarmed by the fact that great influence was being exercised by these foreign, especially German theologians, over Cranmer. I mean, they'd repudiated the authority of foreign popes. Were they now to accept the authority of foreign theologians? People didn't like it. But Edward was okay with it. And that's the way things were going until 1553. In 1553, Edward III fell ill. Now, there's a widespread misconception that Edward was a sickly child and never was really very well. Actually, he wasn't. And recent scholarship has established that pretty clearly. He had some illnesses, but he was pretty active and so forth. I believe we have a picture of Edward, do we not? Yeah, and as you can see, he's very young. Well, he was only 9 when he was put on the throne. And he was crowned at the age of 9. Edward fell ill with what was known in those days as Quartan fever. Quartan fever is malaria. Now, we tend to associate malaria with the tropics, but you can have malaria anywhere you've got the Anopheles mosquito. And there was a major outbreak in England between 1917 and 1921. So on June 21st, 1553, when he was believed, rightly as it turned out, to be dying, he and his council drew up what he called a device for the succession. This is a handwritten document. Edward wrote it himself. There are crossing outs, and I mean, it still exists. There are crossing outs and additions and marginalia. The purpose of this device for the succession was to prevent the country's turn away from Protestantism and back to Catholicism. So what did he do? Well, under the existing law, next in line for the throne was his half-sister Mary. And after that, his half-sister Elizabeth, both of whom had been raised as Catholics. Instead, he named as his heir and named to succeed him a Protestant first cousin teenager named Lady Jane Grey. This ignored the law, specifically the Third Succession Act of 1544, and it also ignored the will of Henry VIII, who had included his Lady Jane Grey in the line of succession way, way, way down in the teens, not the ones. 16 days later, Edward died. That was the 6th of July. The Privy Council met and proclaimed her queen. When she was informed of it, she fainted dead away. The Privy Council at this time was under the leadership of her father-in-law, who was the Duke of Northumberland. But Edward's sister, Mary, was the heir according to the old Act of Parliament and Henry's will. And she had the support of the people. And under the leadership of those who supported her, a fairly sizable group of armed men began moving on London. People started falling away from Lady Jane Grey, including even her father, the Duke of Suffolk, who recognized Mary as the rightful queen. He, the Duke of Suffolk, Jane Grey's father, persuaded her to voluntarily abdicate the throne, which she did, and Mary was named queen. At the beginning of her reign, she had Lady Jane Grey and her father imprisoned in the Tower of London, but he was soon pardoned. She was kept. She and her husband were charged with high treason in November of 1553. She pleaded guilty and was sentenced to death. But the execution of the sentence was suspended indefinitely. However, in the very next year, her father was one of the three prominent leaders of what became known as Wyatt's Rebellion, which was an attempt to remove Mary from the throne in favor of her Protestant sister, Elizabeth. Sorry, I had said Elizabeth had been raised as Catholic. She'd not. Wyatt's Rebellion sealed Lady Jane Grey's fate. The rebellion lasted less than a month, and she and her husband were beheaded. Her father, who'd been captured in a rebellion, was executed 11 days later. Well, Mary earned her nickname of Bloody Mary. She was not only an enthusiastic, but a ferocious persecution of Protestants. By the end of September 53, many important Protestant churchmen, including Thomas Cranmer, were under arrest. Mary's first parliament, which she assembled in October, revoked all of Edward VI's religious legislation. Essentially, it was a turn back to what the doctrine and discipline of the church had been under Henry VIII. Since that discipline forbade priests to marry, all married priests and bishops were removed from office. The initial measures taken by Mary's government confirmed the absolute worst fears of the Protestants. I mean, she came into office and immediately started trying to dismantle what they felt they had accomplished. But it also raised a lot of anxiety among Catholics, because her zeal led them to fear that she would want to restore the authority of the papacy over England. Both groups were even more deeply alarmed when she announced her intention to marry. She intended to marry Philip of Spain, who was not only an enthusiastic and devout Catholic, but he was the son of Charles V, the Habsburg ruler of the Holy Roman Empire. They saw themselves as being reduced to just another subunit or they feared that they would be reduced to just another subunit of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, when Cranmer was arrested and put in prison, it had been on a charge of treason for supporting putting Lady Jane Grey on the throne. His real offense, in Mary's opinion, was that he had led, to a large degree, the Protestantization of the Church of England. And her real goal was to get him tried for heresy. Why? Well, if he could be coerced to recant, to publicly repent, claim that all his Protestantism had been wrong, and disavow all his actions in support of the Protestants, that would be a big win for the Catholic wing, and thereby a big win for her. In order to do that, she had Parliament pass laws that would allow the secular courts to arrest, try, and punish heresy. Cranmer, along with two of his most effective Protestant supporters, Hugh Latimer, Bishop of Worcester, and Nicholas Ridley, Bishop of London. Remember them? I've mentioned them before. They helped write the homilies, the Book of Homilies. They were arrested, and she had them moved from London to Oxford, and they were imprisoned in Oxford. Now, the different areas of England had different sympathies, and obviously there were Catholics in some of the Protestant areas and Protestants in some of the Catholic areas. but they really, there really were red states and blue states, okay? Cambridge was really Protestant, and Oxford was really Catholic, and it stayed that way for a long time. And in Oxford, they were all tried, they were all convicted, and they were all sentenced to be burned at the stake. Latimer and Ridley were executed on October 16, 1555. They were burned to death. It was a very famous execution. Cranmer was brought to witness these two men being burned. They were chained to stakes, wood was piled around them, and very famously, as they were burned at the stake, as the wood was being piled around their bodies, Bishop Latimer cried out, "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England as shall never be put out." But Cranmer wasn't executed that day. He was returned to prison because Cranmer was still officially Archbishop of Canterbury. And Mary wanted the Pope's approval for his execution. And they were still waiting word from Rome. It came in December. The Pope removed Cranmer as Archbishop and released him to the secular courts for whatever they wanted to do to him. They had already been tried and sentenced to be executed, so he knew what that meant. Cranmer was kept in pretty rough circumstances. There's one of the pictures there, I labeled it Old Cranmer. Can you show us that one? Where is it? No, not that one. Yes. As you can see two things. Firstly, he is really aged. He is really aged. He's been through a lot. This is before his imprisonment. We don't know who the artist was with this, by the way, but it's, and notice the long beard. This is also a sign that I'm a Protestant. No, I don't mean me. It's a sign then, because clergy was supposed to be clean shaven, and they always had been, as well as, So he had been through an awful lot in prison. Cranmer broke. Most stories of martyr saints tell of how they showed unshakable resolution in the face of threats and even endured torture. Not Cranmer. In an effort to save his life, he made 4 recantations. Remember, in December, the Pope had made his decision. 4 recantations in January and February. In each of these recantations, he submitted himself to the monarch and recognized the Pope as head of the church. Nevertheless, now normally, if you recanted, then you lost all your property, but you were set free. Mary wanted him dead. And so she decided that he would be executed for heresy on the 7th of March. He then made a 5th recantation in which he stated that he fully accepted all Catholic theology and that there was no salvation to be found outside of the Catholic Church. He repudiated his Protestant theology and affirmed that he was returning to the Catholic Church. He attended Mass, he asked for sacramental confession and sacramental absolution. Well, Mary had what she wanted from Cranmer. Complete and abject surrender, submission to her will and papal authority, and a full repudiation of everything he'd stood for as a Protestant reformer. Cranmer almost certainly expected to escape execution, but he didn't. Mary set the date, 21 March, 1556. On that day, Cranmer was told to make a final public confrontation before a crowd at the University Church, Oxford. Stunningly, we have an eyewitness account. It's a letter. We don't know who wrote it. It's only signed J.A. And it was written 2 days after Cranmer's execution. And I'm going to read most of it to you. It's long, but I saved the time for this because it's got a you were there feeling about it. He begins by saying he doesn't really want to write this letter. It may be a she. I'm saying he. We don't know anything except that it's J.A. Begins by saying he doesn't really want to write this letter because he didn't like what he saw, and that it was unpleasant, but he knew that his friend to whom he was writing it would want to know. And then he continues, but to come to the matter, on Saturday last, being 21 of March, was his day appointed to die. And because the morning was much rainy, the sermon appointed by Mr. Dr. Cole to be made at the stake was made in St. Mary's Church, whither Dr. Cranmer was brought to the mayor and aldermen and my Lord Williams, with whom came divers gentlemen of the shire, Sir T.A. Bridges, Sir John Brown, and others, where was prepared over against the pulpit a high place for him, that all the people might see him. And when he had ascended it, he kneeled him down and prayed, weeping tenderly, which moved a great number to tears, that had conceived an assured hope of his conversion and repentance. When praying was done, he stood up, and having leave to speak, said, Good people, I had intended indeed to desire you to pray for me, which because Mr. Doctor hath desired, and you have done already, I thank you most heartily for it. And now will I pray for myself, as I could best devise for mine own comfort, and say the prayer word for word, as I have here written it. And he read it standing. We don't know what it said. We don't have that proof. And he read it standing, and after kneeled down and said the Lord's Prayer, and all the people on their knees devoutly praying with him. And then rising, he said, Every man desireth, good people, at the time of their death to give some good exhortation, that others may remember after their deaths, and be the better thereby. So I beseech God, grant me grace, that I may speak something at this my departing, whereby God may be glorified and you edified. And he goes on to talk about his various recantations. He then continues, And now I come to the great thing that troubleth my conscience more than any other thing that ever I said or did in my life. And that is the setting abroad of writings contrary to the truth, which here now I renounce and refuse as things written with my hand, contrary to the truth which I thought in my heart, and written for fear of death, and to save my life, if it might be, and that is all such bills which I have written or signed with mine own hand since my degradation. His degradation meaning his removal as Archbishop. Wherein I have written many things untrue. And for as much as my hand offended me in writing contrary to my heart, therefore my hand shall first be punished. For if I may come to the fire, it shall be first burned. And as for the Pope, I refuse him as Christ's enemy and antichrist with all his false doctrine. And here, being admonished of his recantation and dissembling, he said, Alas, my Lord, I've been a man that all my life loved plainness and never dissembled till now against the truth, which I am most sorry for it. He added hereunto that for the sacrament he believed as he had taught in his book against the Bishop of Winchester, and here he was suffered to speak no more. Then was he carried away, and a great number that did run to see him go so wickedly to his death. This man, the author of this, whoever it is of the Catholic party, ran after him, exhorting him, while time was, to remember himself. And one Friar John, a godly and well-learned man, all the way traveled with him to reduce him, to bring him back. But it would not be. What they said in particular I cannot tell, but the effect appeared in the end. For at the stake he professed that he died in all such opinions as he had taught, and oft repented him of his recantation. Coming to the stake with a cheerful countenance and willing mind, he put off his garments with haste and stood upright in his shirt. And a bachelor of divinity named Eli of Brasenose College labored to convert him to his former recantation with 2 Spanish friars. These were Dominicans. And when the friars saw his constancy, they said in Latin to one another, "Let us go from him. We ought not to be nigh him, for the devil is with him." But the bachelor of divinity was more earnest with him, unto whom he answered that, as concerning his recantation, he repented it right sore, because he knew it was against the truth, with other words more. Whereby the Lord Williams cried, make short, get it over with. Then the bishop took certain of his friends by the hand, but the bachelor of divinity refused to take him by the hand, and blamed all the others that did so, and said he was sorry that ever he came in his company. And yet again he required him to agree to his former recantation. And the bishop answered, showing his hand, this was the hand that wrote it, and therefore shall it suffer first punishment. Fire being now put to him, he would have been chained to a stake. He stretched out his right hand and thrust it into the flame and held it there a good space before the fire came to any other part of his body, where his hand was seen of every man sensibly burning, crying with a loud voice, this hand hath offended. As soon as the fire got up, he was very soon dead, never stirring or crying all the while. His patience in the torment, his courage in dying, if it had been taken either for the glory of God, the wealth of his country, or the testimony of truth, as it was for a pernicious error and subversion of true religion, I could worthily have commended the example and matched it with the fame of any father of ancient time. But seeing that not the death, but cause and quarrel thereof commendeth the sufferer, I cannot but much dispraise his obstinate stubbornness and sturdiness in dying, and especially in so evil a cause. Surely his death much grieved every man, but not after one sort. Some pitied to see his body so tormented with the fire raging upon the carcass that counted not of the folly. Others that passed not much of the body lamented to see him spill his soul wretchedly and without redemption, to be plagued forever. His friends sorrowed for love, his enemies for pity, strangers for a common kind of humanity, whereby we are bound one to another. There's a picture somewhere of a monument. Can you find that one for me, please? Yes, that's at Oxford. That is the spot upon which Latimer, Ridley, and later Cranmer were all burned. It's called the Martyrs' Monument. The inscription says, "To the glory of God and in grateful commemoration of his servants Thomas Cranmer, Nicholas Ridley, Hugh Latimer, prelates of the Church of England, who near this spot yielded their bodies to be burned, bearing witness to the sacred truths which they had affirmed and maintained against the errors of the Church of Rome, and rejoicing that to them it was given not only to believe in Christ, but also to suffer for his sake. This monument erected by public subscription in the year of our Lord, 1841. Now, what is Cranmer's legacy? You know, let me point out a few things. Firstly, Cranmer was not a remarkable, groundbreaking, great theologian. He was not particularly creative. He was not particularly innovative. He was not particularly deep. He was widely read. In his various recantations, he also shows that he was certainly not the kind of steadfast and heroic champion of the faith that we see in people like Polycarp or Perpetua and her companions, or any of hundreds, if not thousands, of other Christian martyrs. His great, and really it is great service to God and his church, his legacy, was not as a theologian or an evangelist, or even as an unfailingly courageous man, but as what has been called a liturgical editor. Liturgical because virtually everything he wrote had to do with the public worship of the church. An editor because he included in his liturgical writings very little that was original. This was not because he was incapable of good liturgical prose. One thing that he did write was the prayer of humble access. We do not presume to come to this table. That's Cranmer. Those are his exact words. His method was to translate, adapt, and fine-tune what he considered the best he could find in other existing liturgy. Primarily the Latin Mass, also the Sarum Rite, which was another form of celebration that was allowed in England, and some Lutheran, and even some Calvinist sources, and some Orthodox sources. In 1549, he produced the first Book of Common Prayer. 3 years later, 1552, produced the second Book of Common Prayer, which was revised to reflect a more different theology, but largely similar in both form and language. In 1662, this was reissued with very, very minor changes in language. And this edition remained the official prayer book of the Church of England for centuries. And it has served as a template for all the prayer books used in the Anglican Communion up to the 20th century, when the American church decided to go nuts. What that means is on any given Sunday today, well over 4.5 centuries after Cranmer's death, there are millions of people around the globe holding services and praying prayers that are Cranmer's. If not his writing, his choice, his preservation. Were it not for Cranmer, some of these things would undoubtedly have been lost, and most of them would still be moldering away in libraries somewhere, and nobody would know they even existed. I know of no other single writer of liturgies who can compare to him in his impact on public worship. The fact that it is that edition of 1662 remained until the benighted 20th century the template for every other prayer book in use in Anglican churches all over the world is astonishing. Now, there were minor revisions and local variations, but the heart and soul of them was Cranmer's. And the influence of that work is not confined to Anglicanism. Some of the things he included in the prayer book have been picked up in the official orders of public worship from Methodists, Presbyterians, and others. I've even heard a couple of Baptists use them. On any given Sunday, millions of people are still praying prayers that are the gifts of God given to the church through Thomas Cranmer. So that is why Cranmer is remembered. He's a very different person from most of the other saints we have talked about. And I'll just say one thing. No, I've already said one thing. Cranmer is very often criticized very harshly for his various recantations, that he disavowed what he really believed in order to save his skin. I would remind you that St. Peter did the same thing. And maybe part of what we can take from Cranmer is not to expect ourselves to be absolutely perfect in all respects at all times under great pressure, but never to despair that we can return. So Cranmer believed at the end that he had failed his God, but he did not believe that his God would fail him. So, what do you think?
Oh, my goodness.
Wow.
Oh.
Exhausting.
I know.
When you see the man is so moved to compromise and to be in and that sort of thing, and then at the last minute to die like that is, oh my goodness, oh, it's incredible.
Yeah, but it rings true.
No, I know it does, but I mean, oh my goodness.
We're getting closer to our own times every week, and these people are more and more, I think, easy to identify with as we get closer and closer to our own time.
I've forgotten, I should know this, but I've forgotten, how did they get rid of Mary and get into Elizabeth? I've forgotten how that happened.
She died. She had tumor.
She died of natural death.
Okay, she died, okay.
Natural
So
causes.
Elizabeth, okay, I forgot.
And she had a cancerous tumor.
The Tudors just, I mean, they were hanging on by a thread right from the beginning, in terms of maintaining that dynasty. Well, anything? Speak.
So, obviously my first time attending to this class, so this is probably an obvious question, but he is a saint now
He is remembered in our calendar.
okay.
We don't
He's on the
Okay.
calendar.
So, yes, you can call, look, the question of who's a saint is the Romans have, in the 12th century rather, they started making rules about it. Prior to that time, everybody did what the Catholic Church had done up to that point, and what the Orthodox Church had done, and still does. And that is, any church body can declare someone worthy of being remembered for their contributions, for either for personal holiness or for whatever, miracles, whatever. Because as far as the church is concerned, we're all saints. I mean, actually, I wrote about that in this week's newsletter. I should have brought that and read it. About how our understanding, by our, I mean Anglican understanding, of who is and isn't a saint. Basically, everybody. Because saint is just a variation of the word sanctus, which is both a noun and an adjective. In Latin, it means holy, and holy means belonging to God, and we're the people of God, so you're all saints, you're stuck with it. But some people are deemed worthy of remembrance and respect because of their contributions or the special grace that they have shown. So the special grace that God has shown through them. It doesn't mean that God loves them more than us. It doesn't mean that they are a different order of being. And the way it always had worked up till the 12th century when the Romans started putting the rules in was any local church body, if you had somebody that you thought was especially holy or had worked miracles, you could refer to them as Saint whoever, you know. And if your local diocese decided to adopt that person as a saint, they could say, okay, we're going to keep this person as a saint, and on this day every year, we'll remember them in the Eucharist. And that's the way it was. And in Anglicanism, that's the way it still is. If a particular diocese has someone that they want remembered, the bishop can, well, actually, nowadays we usually want it to be approved by the council, by the synod. Then they can be entered into the calendar for that diocese. Nobody's required to keep saints' days. You don't have to, but it's more a bottom-up process rather than a top-down process. And the big difference, other than procedurally, is that in Anglicanism there's no requirement that you have to have verified miracles to be a saint. Many of the saints do. You know, you hear when we talked about Becket, we talked about how his shrine, the place of his martyrdom and his burial, became such a magnet for people seeking healings and so forth. But it's not a requirement. The requirement is popular acclamation, to be honest. It's much more an organic than an institutional sort of approach. Ma'am.
I know that you spoke of the Lambeth Conference that was supposed to be sort of a framework for future.
The Lambeth Quadrilateral. Yeah.
Okay, quadrilateral. And the four marks of the church, Holy Scripture, the two creeds, the sacraments of baptism and Lord's Supper, and the historic episcopate. Is that where we stand as the Anglican Catholic Church today? Is that kind of what we do? I mean, I'm not really totally sure whether we're Catholic or partly Catholic, partly Protestant.
Protestant,
Sure.
tiny bit Catholic.
There are people who would say, yes, that's it. There are others who would say, no, I believe there are 7 sacraments. But apart from that, that would be the primary difference.
Okay.
But notice the Lambeth Quadrilateral says it doesn't say you can't believe there are 7, it says you have to believe there are 2. And that the Lord's Supper must be celebrated with the words of institution. This is my body.
And the Protestants at this time of Edward in England and Cranmer, had they just simply disowned the authority of the Last Supper? I mean, they didn't do Mass, they didn't do that?
Oh, they did things. They did not refer to it as a Mass. They referred to it usually as the Lord's Supper. About the terminology there are different terms you'll hear used. Communion literally refers to actually receiving. That's communicating, okay? Some people will refer to the whole service as a communion service, but really that's a part of the service. The Lord's Supper, that's a reference primarily to the Last Supper, a remembrance of, which is before the crucifixion. When the Eucharist is a word that means thanksgiving in Greek. And it's a word that the early church used a lot, okay? Mass is a word that comes in the Western church. It's a variant on Missa Finitus Est. The Mass is finished, okay, which means, it means the whole service from the beginning to the end. Generally speaking, well, definitely speaking, Protestants reject the use of the word Mass because it's too Roman. By we, I mean Anglicans, well, high church Anglicans anyhow, and certainly Catholics, do not generally use the term Lord's Supper because it seems not to take into account what Jesus is really saying, which is this is a participation in a sacrifice which will be fulfilled on the cross. It seems to be too much focused on the human aspect of let's all sit around the table. What the Protestants believed, what the Protestants did not believe is that the elements were in any respect the body and blood of Christ. Simply that they represented or symbolized the body and blood of Christ.
Okay.
That there was no
So
reality
was that
to
the
it.
major difference then?
Hell yes.
Sorry.
Sorry.
I mean,
Oh,
it is.
wow, we're gonna have to edit that out.
Was that the major difference at that time of Cranmer?
Yes.
Between the Protestants and Roman
It was a
Catholics?
major difference.
major,
It was
okay.
not the only
The other
one.
was the authority of the Pope, I
Well,
suppose.
well, not only the authority of Pope, the authority of the church to pronounce forgiveness of sins.
Priesthood, celibacy, I
The
suppose.
importance of embodying one's faith in good work. The question of the authority of tradition. See, what happened, and you can't really generalize. There were the Zwinglians, there were the Anabaptists, there were the Calvinists, there were the Lutherans, there were all these groups. And even within those groups, there were differences. Some people are so shocked to discover that the Swedish Lutheran Church has bishops. They maintained the apostolic succession, whereas the others did not. But where was I going with that? Shoot, I lost myself. Oh,
There's hope for you.
generally speaking, it was a disavowal of in Luther's let me rephrase that. As far as Luther, the main doctrine, the real doctrine that defined was salvation by faith alone, and the only authority in the church was Scripture. And the Calvinists the same way, although as far as they were concerned, salvation wasn't by faith, it was by predestination. I can't quite figure that one out, but that never made any sense to me. However, the Catholic position, classic Catholic position, was that the primary authority in the church is the authority of Scripture, but that there is also tradition. And by tradition, we do not mean, well, that's the way we've always done it here. The tradition means, to Anglicans specifically, what did the church teach and practice while the church was still one, before the East and West split? In other words, what we call conciliar Catholicism. Because in that period, the chief in the earliest period of the church, there was no pope. The popes were a later invention. There was no pope. That when changes or when definitions needed to be arrived at or decisions needed to be made, they were made by church councils. That is, councils of the bishops advised by others. And our attitude, that's why we talk about the historic episcopate. because that's why a lot of very, very high church Anglicans would never become Roman Catholics, would never, as we say, swim the Tiber. Because they cannot accept certain things that came in later after that division. Now, with the exception of papal authority, I would say that the doctrinal changes that came in, we make a distinction between what is salvation knowledge and what is adiaphora. Adiaphora essentially means there are things that you can believe or not believe, and it won't make any difference in the state of your standing with God. And we put, there are a lot of things that come under that heading for us. What was that phrase again? I can't remember it, never mind. But the idea is that there are certain basic doctrines that define the church, certain basic actions that define the church, and there are other things that the church has picked up, some of which are variable. That's why I didn't read the Chicago Lambeth Quadrilateral to you. What it actually says is the historic episcopate locally adapted. So, for instance, in some churches in the Anglican Communion, you have a specific a slot for a bishop, for an archbishop. Okay, the Episcopal Church doesn't have that. It has a presiding bishop. The archbishop in most Anglican provinces is a collection of dioceses. In most Anglican provinces, there is a specific spot geographically that is given to the Archbishop of Canterbury. He's also the bishop of that spot. So the Archbishop of Canterbury is also the Bishop of Canterbury. The Archbishop of Cape Town is also the Bishop of Cape Town. In the Diocese of Central Africa, they don't do that. When there's a vacancy in the Archiepiscopate, they elect an Archbishop, and he stays where he is. It doesn't matter. The point is to me, those are adiaphora. Those are things that really don't matter. Or they don't, well, I shouldn't dismiss them. They are not of ultimate importance. Ma'am, I'm sorry.
Would you put, and maybe you discussed this already, so if everyone's already heard this, just say so, but would you put praying to saints in the category of adiaphora, or is that something, how is that viewed in the Anglican Church?
It is seen as adiaphora, and primarily, I've heard Father Wright preach on this pretty well. It's not a matter so much of praying to the saints, it's a matter of asking the saints to pray for us.
Right. We are asking for them to, yeah.
The idea being that we are all linked together. And, there are some biblical verses that can be brought forward in support of that. They aren't specific. The one that is often used is when Jesus talks to his critics. He says, I forget the precise wording, but basically the argument goes, we talk about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, okay? And he says to them, are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob dead or alive? God's not the God of the dead, he's the God of the living.
Yeah.
And look, we don't know what the next life is. There are classic example of adiaphora. Protestant denominations are split over this. So far, none of them have gone to war with each other, but they have split. The question of when we die, are we immediately brought into the presence of God, or do we sleep until the last, the last resurrection, the final resurrection of the dead? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all. Because in either case, you're going to wind up in the presence of God, you're gonna have to tolerate
Right.
that. It's, you know, after all, it won't even matter as an experience. If I die tonight and am immediately ushered into the presence of God, that's great. If I die tonight and sleep for 10,000 years, it'll be for me like it was immediate, because I won't remember the sleeping time. What's the difference? That's classic adiaphora. And yet people get tangled up over it. Sir?
I had, if you don't mind, a couple super quick questions and maybe a little harder one. Quick ones are, why didn't Mary just have Cranmer removed as Archbishop of Canterbury rather than having to appeal to the Pope? And why didn't, the other quick one is why, you want me to go through all of them first, or?
You mean, why did she appeal to,
Yeah,
why did she wait for the Pope's approval to kill him?
Well, you said he was still technically Archbishop of Canterbury,
Yes,
so
he
she had to
was.
do this. Why couldn't she just say you're no longer that?
Oh,
She's Catholic.
well, that's a good question. I think you're asking me to get into her head, okay, so I'll do the best I can. I think that this was yet one more step towards bringing England back under papal authority. Because she didn't have to, I don't think she had to do it, but she chose to do it.
Gosh, okay.
And I think the whole thing with Cranmer was such a visible symbol of the Protestant movement, that anything she could do to beat him down, and anything she could do to elevate the authority of the papacy, she was going to do. Also, this delay, they kept working on him to break him, and they finally did.
Till she overplayed her
She
hand.
really did. Oh, definitely. I don't think that she wanted, well, I'm certain, she didn't want him to go to the stake as a heretic, still proclaiming his faithfulness. She wanted to break him. And I think she may have delayed just for the sake of having more time to work on it. And it worked.
Plus,
Thank
if she herself removed him, she would essentially be acknowledging what her father had claimed, that he was the head of the Church of England.
Well, officially she still was, but,
Right.
but she was moving in another direction, for sure.
My other quick question was, why was Mary raised as a Catholic and Elizabeth wasn't?
Different mothers.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
right.
Sorry.
Okay.
Your mama.
And then my, little trickier question. You
Different
said
guardians, too.
you said you don't recommend the 39 articles. Can you?
The 39 articles are come right out of the 40 articles, okay? And they were specifically directed to things that were hot issues at that time. And consequently, they're the product not of long, reasoned, carefully weighed checks and balances type stuff within the Anglican world. They're polemics. And that rarely gives you a deep wisdom. When you're arguing a case, you're going to argue it with whatever you can get your hands on. And I just don't, I don't find it authoritative. And it's never been considered authoritative in the sense of being canon law. It's not. It's really a statement of the very, very Protestant position of one time and one place. It's interesting to me that, sorry, and this is sort of a sidelight, with regard to the Lambeth Quadrilateral, as adopted at Chicago, it did not include the Apostles' Creed, but only the Nicene Creed. That was added on at Lambeth. There were a couple of other trivial changes, but that was the only substantive one. Ma'am?
Does the Anglican Catholic Church consider the, I'm not sure, the cult of the Virgin Mary as adiaphora, or? I'm probably using the wrong word, but.
No, that is the right word, it's not a
What is that
pejorative
word
in
that
church
It's a
language.
cult of the
But
Virgin
the
Mary
word, the,
as an adiaphora, one of the things that doesn't really matter whether you believe it or not.
how do you spell it?
I-A,
ADIAPHORA.
ADIAPHORA, okay.
Yeah, I think so, I believe so. Certainly there are some people who have a considerable devotion to the Virgin and probably believe a lot of things
A lot of my
that are
Catholic
Roman
friends do.
Catholic doctrine but are not our doctrine.
Yeah.
And I would say probably most of us don't. I certainly do. I have an extremely high regard for the Virgin and her place in Christian theology and her place in biblical theology. But I certainly don't agree with a lot of the Catholic doctrine. It doesn't make any sense to me. And a lot of that is 19th century.
Is it really?
It was,
Absolutely.
it was, I'm sure I've told you about Cardinal Gibbons.
Okay, so why is it,
Cardinal Gibbons was Archbishop of Baltimore. And at the council that instituted a lot of these things regarding the Virgin's place was also the council that promulgated the doctrine of papal infallibility.
Oh.
And before Cardinal Gibbons left, he had been very much against it. He made it very clear that he did not believe that that was an appropriate thing for
The
the church
papal
to say.
infallibility.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
When he returned, this is on a steamship, of course. When he returned, he was met at the docks at Baltimore by a horde of reporters. And of course, he was asked, what do you think now of the doctrine of papal infallibility? Is the Pope infallible? And his response was, well, he called me Gibbons for the whole conclave.
That's funny.
Which is a nice dodge.
Yeah, that was a dodge.
Yeah.
So, what is the bright line that separates Catholic from Protestant?
Yeah,
Uh,
good question. But so-
the sacraments, I think. Sacrament, well, it depends on which Protestant you're talking about. I mean, the Baptists deny the reality of any sacrament except baptism. Okay? I think there are a number. One is, of course, the doctrine of papal infallibility. The other is,
Well, that would be Roman Catholic.
yes. Oh, you're talking about, oh, I see what you're, sorry. Woo, okay, you're smarter than I am.
What do you mean? Between Anglicanism, Anglican, Catholic, and Protestant, or what?
No,
it's
no,
not
there-
Roman?
remember, there are other non-Roman Catholic bodies. There's the
Yeah.
Polish National Catholic Church, there's the Old Catholics.
There's Eastern Rite Catholic.
Yeah, well, no, the Eastern Rite Catholics are in communion with Rome.
Oh, okay.
I would say that probably varies from denomination to denomination.
Okay.
I mean, I consider myself, I'm very much formed by Anglicanism, but I can very happily consider myself Catholic as long as nobody thinks I'm Roman Catholic, because I really do believe that the church should be one, and it was for a long time, and that I think is, I hope, is God's eventual will for the church. There are a lot of people who will say that the church is one because if you've been baptized, you're a Christian and so forth. I'm talking about visible organic unity. And what happened in Anglicanism in the United States is when the Episcopal Church decided to stop being Anglican. They still call themselves Anglican, but they broke with the Anglican quadrilateral in practice. They maintained it just like they say the creed, and then they say things that make it clear they don't mean it. One of the things that when they broke, a lot of Anglicans, traditional Anglicans, said no, we can't go that way, and they met at St. Louis and adopted something called the Declaration of St. Louis. And very shortly thereafter, and they were going to form a new Anglican grouping, not connected with Canterbury. And what happened is sin and egos, an awful lot of contending egos in that movement, and it splintered into a whole bunch of small bodies. And what has been happening for the last 15 years is a recoalescing, bit by bit by bit. And let's see, Claude knows more about this than I do because he's been involved longer, but when we were down in Atlanta, there were what, 6, I think?
Yeah.
There were 6 bodies that met together, 6 Anglican, what we call continuing Anglican bodies that met together. And they all said, we will be in communion with one another. We will recognize one another's clergy. We will recognize one another's people if they want to come and receive communion. We will allow clergy from one or the other of these to be hired by the others, and we'll just see how this works out. Since that time, what, 3 of them have now come together under the banner of ACC, because the ACC was the oldest. In fact, our province is called the original province of the Anglican Catholic Church. We are still in talks with the others. And the idea is, and this is very Anglican, the idea is we are not going to try to impose a top-down unity. We'll try living together, we'll try understanding each other, and hope that God brings us together. Well, it's working. It's working slowly, but it's working. And I consider that to be, there are 2 things that, well, there are a number of things that mark Anglicanism. One is, classical Anglicanism. One is a high degree of comfort with ambiguity. I mean it, okay? And we are perfectly willing to say, well, if you want to understand it this way and I want to understand it that way, it's okay as long as we both agree it's true. So we tend to be less dogmatic about trying to read people out. Okay. Another is being willing to be patient for the church, being willing to be patient, period. There's a saying, church time is long time, and it is. And I think the approach that the continuing churches are taking is very spiritually healthy. It's not trying to say, we're gonna eat this denomination or whatever. We're gonna absorb them or whatever. It's, can we grow together? And the key word there is grow. It's an organic approach rather than a mechanical approach. I find it very healthy. I was not raised in Anglicanism. To be perfectly honest, I fell in love with the prayer book. I remember the first time Gwen and I went to Good Shepherd Church in Richmond, and I heard the general confession, and I thought, okay, these are my people. And the prayer book, again, back to Cranmer, I guess, the prayer book, the classic prayer book is a great asset. If you travel abroad to English-speaking countries or countries where they speak a language with which you're familiar, I urge you, go into an Anglican church and look at their prayer book. And you will see it's very similar in many ways to what we do. A lot of it is a straightforward translation. Now, you'll see some different saints in it. You'll see some saints you won't see here. You'll miss some saints that should be here. You may find the order of things a little different and so forth. But Cranmer's framework remains, and his influence on public worship is really extraordinary. I don't think anybody other than maybe Martin Luther had as much influence. Sure.
Did he pick the readings for each Sunday, that part of the prayer book?
He had other people with him doing it, and those have been changed from time to time, I believe. I think they have. And some, since Cranmer's time, some days have been added, some days have been taken away, and so forth. But the framework remains. And morning and evening prayer are based on the framework of monastic prayers. That's really what it's a simplified version of the monastic hours. And the Eucharist, of course, is based primarily on the Mass with a lot of input from the Lutheran order of service. And just an example, there's bound to be a prayer book here somewhere. When the
There's one kind of right behind your head.
just an example of how, yeah, here it is, of how Cranmer worked. There was a lot of, part of the controversy, as a very important part of the controversy, was about the presence of Christ in the Eucharist. You know, is this the body and blood of Christ, or does this represent or signify the body of Christ? Is it just a remembrance? And what we are, you know, what it says here, the body of our Lord Jesus Christ, which was given for thee, preserve thy body and soul unto everlasting life. Take and eat this in remembrance that Christ died for thee, and feed on him in thy heart by faith with thanksgiving. That's a Catholic statement followed by a Protestant statement.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And they were
And
separately in the prayer book for a time.
Ma'am,
One or the other was in the prayer book
prior
for a
to,
time, and then they were shoved together.
and Cranmer put them together, okay? There's a certain amount of intellectual humility in that, okay? And a certain amount, I think, of Christian charity. I mean, I may be 199% sure that my position is the correct one. I may also be wrong. And the willingness to coexist is what kept the Anglican communion together for a very long time. It was a sort of gentleman's agreement, if you want to put it that way, that certain things, you know, I don't believe this, but this guy does. And it was an interesting thing. In almost every diocese in America was either low church or high church, either more Protestant or more Catholic. But every low church diocese had at least one Catholic church, and every high church diocese had at least one low church. It was just the way it was. In fact, I remember Frisbee Hendrick's father in the Diocese of Virginia, which is unbelievably low church, was unbelievably low church, and had been since the 19th century. Frisbee Hendrick's father was the only priest in the diocese that everyone, including all the bishops, called father. He was our resident high churchman. Okay. And I'm sure the same was, you know, it cut both ways. So, and even at Virginia Seminary, we had a couple of high church, which was super low. We had a couple of high churchmen. Richard Reed, particularly, was a New Testament professor, very good one, was Father Reed, and everybody else was usually Jack or Joe. You know? That tolerance in religious matters foundered badly on political matters.
because he was always asked that question about, he would always answer it to people saying, it is what Jesus said, this is my body, this is my blood, and left it at that.
Well, what I will say about that,
Mhm.
very simply, is, both Greek and Aramaic, which is what Jesus spoke, Aramaic, what Jesus spoke, and Greek, what the Gospels are written in, are very subtle languages.
Yes, they are.
And they have plenty of words for represent and symbolize. That's not what it says. It says is. Ask me to explain how, I can't. I know I can't. And I think that's part of where the Romans go wrong. They try, under the influence of Aquinas, they have tried to explain the how of that.
Can't.
You can't. You can't.
Can you quote Queen Elizabeth I?
I was just trying to think of it. You're reading my mind. What was it? God said it.
Oh, yes, I-
I'm thinking,
God spake it, and I take it,
and
it basically, I believe it because God said so,
Yeah.
but it's much more
Father Ronnie
relevant.
used to pronounce it, you do that a lot.
Yes, I cannot remember that. If I can, I'll bring it next week.
John Donne.
But that was Queen Elizabeth. What happens next is what's known as the Elizabethan settlement or the Elizabethan compromise. Elizabeth managed to beat it into the church that they should all get along. And under her, there was persecution of Roman Catholics, for sure. But there was not this radical Protestantism, and a lot of people continued to be faithful to the Catholic faith, even if they were not interested in being under the Pope. By the way, one of the things that's very interesting here to me, within the last, 30, 40 years, there's been a lot of archaeological work done at Jamestown. Now, when I was in school, high school, grade school, Jamestown was represented largely as a commercial enterprise by the Virginia Company. But there was another side to Jamestown, and part of that side is there was concern about the Spaniards moving north up and moving up and getting established, and there were Spanish missionaries far north as Maine. You remember that, Gwen, when we went to that museum? They talked about that. Anyhow, and it was pointed out that when you look at how Jamestown was built, that two of the three guns were pointed out to the river. that wasn't concerned about anything. Anyhow, that this was a concern about Catholicism, about the Catholic Spanish. Well, as I say, within the last half century, there's been a lot of archaeological work down there, and they found many, 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 many bodies, because people died like flies. And one thing they keep finding is very small crucifixes, rosaries, miraculous, that sort of thing. These were so small they could be hidden in your. Some of these people were secret Catholics. Doesn't mean they were spies, doesn't mean they were Spanish. But they considered themselves Catholics, but they knew darn well that wasn't going to get them any favors if they showed it. So it's really fascinating.
That is interesting.
And that's a secret history that we'll never know. Unless something turns up. There's always possibility of new things turning up. Guys, I have held you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Very
good.
I'm not sure who I'm gonna look at next week. I'll try to get us out of England if I can find anybody that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Oh, not at all.